Welcome to our video on the US elections. In this video, we will take you through the history, process, and current landscape of American elections. From voting rights to electoral maps, we will break down the complexities of the US electoral system. Despite progress, voting restrictions persist. Understanding this history helps us appreciate the ongoing struggle for voting rights.
It's that time again. The United States presidential election is around the corner. Every 4 years, the American people decide whether a Democrat or a Republican gets to live in the White House for the next 4 years. But how exactly does the United States presidential election work? Well, to understand this, we have to take a closer look at the entire election year. It all starts with the primaries, in which Democrats and Republicans each decide who is going to be their presidential candidate. How the primaries work and who is eligible to vote in them varies from state to state. In some states, every registered voter is allowed to vote. In others, only voters registered with a particular party can cast a ballot in that party's primary. Even the dates the primaries are held are different in each state, although there are some cluster primary dates. For example, Super Tuesday. On Super Tuesday, multiple states hold their primary. And it gets even more complicated than that, because the people don't actually elect the presidential candidate directly. With their vote, they are technically electing delegates, who in turn will support a certain candidate. In a primary, each candidate is awarded a certain amount of delegates, or representatives, based on the amount of votes they receive. Those delegates will later vote for their assigned candidate. Once the delegates from the various primaries have been awarded, you can already get a good sense of who will become the presidential candidate. However, the delegates don't officially vote for their candidates until the National Convention. In the end, a candidate must receive over half of the delegate votes to win the party's nomination. If no candidate receives over half of the delegate votes at the convention, the party renegotiates its entries into the presidential race. Additionally, sometimes candidates will end their presidential bids, and then the delegates will have to vote again. In that case, the delegates don't necessarily have to vote for their candidates again, but are now free to choose whomever they like. This procedure continues until a presidential candidate has been found. Once the two parties have officially chosen who is going head-to-head in the presidential race, the actual general election is held on the Tuesday after the first Monday in November. Registered voters over 18 get to vote for their president on that day. However, similar to the primaries, the president is not elected directly here either. The vote tally for each candidate determines how many electors are awarded to that candidate. These electors will then elect the candidate. Each state has a different number of electors depending on how many people live in that state. But the electors cannot simply vote for the candidate they wish. In 48 of the 50 states, the elector tally is awarded winner-take-all. This means the winner of that state gets all the votes from that state. Let's say a state has 10 electors. If at the end of the voting day, the tally awards 6 electors to the Democratic candidate and 4 to the Republican, the Democrat has won the election in this state and gets all 10 votes, while the Republican gets nothing. The winner takes all. This is why in so-called swing states, states in which both parties have an equally high chance of taking the win, candidates are campaigning harder than in other states. It is hard to predict the electoral outcome pre-election in these states. There is a total of 535 electors. The candidate who can secure more than half of the electoral vote has won the election. This is why electors from the swing states are especially important. Once the electors have been awarded, it is basically clear who will be the next president of the United States, while officially the decision is only made by the Electoral College, which is the body made up of the awarded electors. This is usually 41 days after Election Day. On that day, the electors vote in their states. These votes are then counted in Congress around the beginning of January. And it is in Congress, too, where the next occupant of the White House is later officially announced. Finally, the inauguration of the next president takes place on January 20th to formally end the election year.
The US electoral system has a rich history. Let's start with the 15th Amendment, granting voting rights to African American men.
How to register to vote as a new U.S. citizen. If you're a new citizen and you'll be 18 before Election Day, you can vote in federal, state, and local elections. Here's how to register to vote. Different state, different rules. Each state has different voting rules. However, with exception to North Dakota, all states require citizens to register if they want to vote. How you register to vote can vary too. In many cases, you can register to vote online, at the Department of Motor Vehicles, or by using the National Voter Registration Form. Check your state's registration deadline. You can check your state's deadline for registering at usvotefoundation.org. For your state's voter registration process, visit your state or local territory's election office website. Make sure you're registered to vote. To confirm you're registered to vote, you can check your voter registration status online, over the phone, by mail, or in person. This also varies by state, so it's helpful to check with your local election office. When checking if you're registered, make sure your name is accurate and on the voter list, your address is up to date, the polling place is correct. If you can't find your name on the voter list, reach out to your election office as soon as possible. Every time you move or change your name, you have to update your registration or re-register. Find your polling place. Once you've registered to vote, your election office will likely send you a voter registration card that tells you your polling place. On Election Day, you'll go there to vote. You'll probably need to show an ID before you can vote, and if you know you can't make it to your polling place on Election Day, you might qualify to vote by mail.
You'll hear a lot of this.
What do the national polls look like?
Hillary Clinton's national lead. Nationally, Joe Biden is currently ahead.
But these national polls don't actually tell you who's going to win.
Throw the national polls out the window. They don't matter at all. What matters are those swing states.
Ah, yes, the swing states. Most democracies around the world elect their head of state with a popular vote, so whoever gets the most votes wins. But in America, we do it a little differently. The US is the only country that picks its president using something called the Electoral College. It's made up of delegates from each US state. When Americans vote for president, what they're actually voting for is who their state will vote for. This is why, every so often, someone wins the presidency without winning the popular vote. That's happened twice in just the past 20 years. The majority of Americans do not like the system, and haven't for a long time. Both political parties have made attempts to get rid of it. So why does the US still use the Electoral College? And who actually benefits from it? The Electoral College is based on how people are represented in Congress, where each state has a number of representatives based on its population, and every state also gets 2 senators. So, for example, let's look at Texas, which has a huge population, and Vermont, which has a really small one. Texas has 36 representatives in Congress. Vermont only gets 1. Representatives in both states each represent roughly the same number of people. In the Electoral College, a state gets the same number of delegates as their congressional representatives, plus 2 for each senator. So Texas has 38 electoral votes, Vermont has 3. But this combination makes the number of people each delegate represents way different between states. In Texas, 1 electoral delegate represents 3 times the amount of people as 1 in Vermont. And that makes each individual person's vote in Vermont a lot more influential. The Electoral College creates discrepancies like this all over the country. A voter in Wyoming is worth 3.5 times as much as a voter in California. And the winner of the presidential election is the candidate who gets 270 or more of these Electoral College votes. These are the results of the 2016 election by state. You're probably more familiar with this version of it, a map of red states and blue states. But this chart tells a different story. you can see that no state is actually all red or all blue. But almost every state awards its electoral votes the same way. The candidate who gets the most votes in a state gets all its electoral votes. If they win the state by 1%, they win 100% of the electoral votes. In 2016, more than 4 million people voted for Donald Trump in California. In fact, more people voted for him there than in any other state except for 2. But it didn't matter. Hillary Clinton got more votes there, so she got all 55 of its electoral votes. Clinton never even campaigned in California. Polling showed she'd easily win the state. Trump only visited Texas once. He knew he'd basically have that state's electoral votes locked. But they both visited Florida 35 or more times. That's because Florida is usually a swing state. Polls show that the vote there could swing to one party or another nearly every election. Trump only won it in 2016 by 100,000 votes, out of more than 9 million. Swing states have changed over time thanks to shifting demographics and political views, and it's states like these where presidential candidates spend most of their time campaigning. It also means these states have way more influence over the election than these ones. A study found that voters in Michigan had 51 times the amount of influence on the 2016 election as someone from a state like Utah. Voters in states like California or Missouri mattered very little. Swing states are where the election actually takes place. They get the attention and the influence, and they only exist because of the Electoral College. It doesn't seem very fair, but the Electoral College has always shifted power away from some people and towards others. It was how it was designed. Back when there were just a few states, not 50, they had to get all the states to agree on the Constitution. One problem. The northern states, which were largely anti-slavery, wanted only free people to count in the population towards electoral votes, which they had more of. The pro-slavery southern states were worried that they would be constantly outvoted and wanted enslaved people to count in determining the population. As a compromise, they settled on something called the 3/5 Clause. It established that an enslaved person would only count as 3/5 of a person. In 1800, Pennsylvania, a northern state, and Virginia, a southern one, had about the same number of free people living there. But Virginia was also home to hundreds of thousands of enslaved people who had no freedom, let alone a vote, and ended up with more votes in the Electoral College than Pennsylvania. That year, those extra electoral votes gave the candidate from Virginia just enough to win. Even after the U.S. finally abolished slavery and eventually gave Black Americans the right to vote, white Southern leaders found ways to keep them from voting, like with discriminating laws like poll taxes and acts of violence. This meant they continued to have overrepresentation in the Electoral College on behalf of a large population that couldn't vote. The first time Congress attempted to replace the Electoral College with a simple popular vote was back in 1816. But senators from southern states blocked it, saying it would be deeply injurious to them. In 1969, Congress came even closer. Replacing the Electoral College had support in both parties, and even passed the House, but it was blocked again by southern senators. A senator from Alabama wrote, "The Electoral College is one of the South's few remaining political safeguards. Let's keep it." Why change a system that historically had, and still was, benefiting white Southerners? Today, the states that the Electoral
Registering to vote is crucial. Make sure you are eligible and informed. Who votes matters. Understanding demographics help us grasp election outcomes. Current elections are shaped by key policy debates, healthcare, economy, climate change. Special elections and referendums address specific issues or vacancies. State and local elections determine governors, mayors, and city councils. Federal elections include presidential, congressional, and Senate races. Who votes matters. Understanding demographics help us grasp election outcomes. Current elections are shaped by key policy debates, healthcare, economy, climate change. Remember, voting is your voice. Make it heard.